Today I'm going to show you how to make one of these beautiful patchwork cushion covers. It's made from offcuts of fabric, so it's a good way of getting rid of some of your scraps of fabric. It does have binding tape around the edges, but I've hopefully made these as easy to do as possible. There's no stitching in the ditch, and I've also made it a little bit quicker to do the patchwork squares. So let's get started. These are the fabrics you will need. First, cut your wadding or batting to a 6-inch square. The piece that I'm using is an offcut, and it was very near the size that I want. So first I level off one side, and then using my quilter's ruler I measure the 6 inches on one side and make sure that it's lined up on the bottom. And then I turn, and again using my ruler I line up the bottom line to make sure that it's level and that we have 6 inches. By the way, this ruler is 6.5 inches wide, so there will always be half an inch over at the side. So line up the bottom and then cut. And I think that's about it. We should have a 6-inch square. You will need 9 of these squares in total. You will also need 9 squares, 6-inch by 6-inch of plain fabric. To make the patchwork squares, first lay out one piece of the plain fabric followed by a piece of your wadding or batting. Then choose your first 2 pieces of fabric that you're going to use. Place the first one down right side up, and then the next one goes on top of it with right side facing down. Then you need to pin these 2 pieces in place, ready for sewing. Sew the 2 pieces together, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance and back tacking at the start and the finish. Cut off any loose threads and then press. Then sort out your next strip of fabric, or actually I'm going to do 2 strips of fabric, because if you can, do 2 at once. Providing they're not going to overlap, you can do 2 fabrics at a time. So if they're on opposite sides and they're not going to touch, do 2 pieces at a time. This makes the process a lot quicker. When you've sorted your first piece out, pin it into position with right sides facing. Then find another piece of fabric to go on the other side, on the opposite side, and then pin this in place with right sides facing. At the sewing machine, sew down one side, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish. Then turn your fabric around, and we're going to sew back down the opposite side in the opposite direction, back tacking at the start and the finish. Fold the 2 pieces of fabric over to the right side and give a quick press. Now we can find another 2 pieces of fabric. So find a piece of fabric you like that's going to fit and then pin in place, making sure that it's going to cover up all the wadding and you're not going to have any raw edges showing. That's the first piece done, and now we're just going to find one more to go over in the right hand corner. I think that's a bit too small. Yes, that's not going to work. I need to find a bigger piece. There we go, that one fits. It's the same as one I've already done, but I think it will be okay. So let's pin that in place. Take over to the sewing machine and sew together, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance on each side, sewing up one side and back down the other side. Then give a quick press. I don't know whether you noticed, but I've missed filming one. The pink floral bit down one side I put on after the other 2, but I missed filming it. But I think by now you get the idea of what to do. Next, trim off any loose threads and place face down on your cutting mat. We're going to trim the sides to make them all level. So start by making a nice straight cut on one of your sides. My quilter's ruler is 6.5 inches wide. I've got it the wrong way up there, but the wrong way around, so you can't quite see, but it is 6.5 inches wide. So just remember that when cutting, if you have one that's 6.5 inches wide. A lot of them are, well, most of them are, but we're doing 6 inches, not 6.5. Anyway, once you've straightened off one side, keep rotating until you've got all of your sides nice and level and hopefully measuring 6 inches on each side. And you should end up with something that looks a bit like this. Continue this process until you have 9 patchwork squares all finished. Next, we need to make some binding tape. We don't need to cut this on the bias, we can cut it straight. I folded my fabric in half and then in half again, and I'm just going to neaten off the top edge to make sure I've got a nice straight line to start with. My fabric is 44 inches wide. I think that's 112 centimetres. And I'm going to cut 2 strips of 2 inches wide, that's 5 centimetres, and 2 strips of 1 inch, which is 2.5 centimetres. And that should be enough to join my squares together. From one of your 2-inch wide strips, you need to cut off 6 6-inch lengths. And from the other one, you need to cut 2 18-inch lengths. And cut exactly the same from your 1-inch wide 2 lengths of fabric. Fold your 2-inch strips in half and press. Then place the 1-inch strip on the back of one of your squares of fabric. Turn it over and then place the folded 2-inch strip on the patchwork side with the raw edges in line with the edge of the patchwork square and the 1-inch strip on the other side, and then pin or clip in place. At the sewing machine, sew along the edge, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish. To join the second patchwork square, place it on top of the first square with both the backs facing and in line with the 1-inch strip of binding tape with raw edges together. Then pin or clip in place. At the sewing machine, sew, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish and removing your pins as you go along. You will need to hold the previous seam edges out of the way whilst you're sewing to make sure they don't get caught up. Your 2 patchwork pieces are now joined at the back. All we need to do is fold the front 2-inch strip over and pin in place. Top stitch down both sides of the strip, taking an 1/8 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish. Now we can add the third piece to the first row in exactly the same way. Place the 1-inch strip on the back of the third patchwork square with the right side of the 1-inch strip facing the back of the patchwork square. Holding it in place, turn the patchwork square over and place the 2-inch strip on top, making sure that the raw edges are facing outwards. Then pin or clip in place, making sure you catch both of the strips, the one on the front and the one on the back. Then sew together, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance and back tacking at the start and the finish, removing the pins as you go along. To attach the third piece to our strip, start by placing the third patchwork square with backs together against the second patchwork square, and then pin the 1-inch strip to the back of the second patchwork square. Then, as before, join the 2 pieces together, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish and making sure that you hold the previous seam edges out of the way. Next, iron the 2-inch strip down. The 2 lots of raw edges should sandwich together in between the strip. If you do need to, you can trim them down a little bit to make sure that it all fits nice and flush. Then pin in place. Then top stitch down both sides of the binding strip, sewing up one side, turn around and come back down the other side, back tacking at the start and the finish. That's our first strip of 3 patchwork squares joined together. We need to make another 2. So go ahead and make 2 more rows of patchwork squares with 3 squares in each row. Fold your first 2-inch wide strip of tape in half and press. Trim your strips to make sure the edges are nice and level, because they do tend to move about a bit when you're making them, and you want nice straight level edges for joining them together. And then decide in which order you'd like your strips to go. When you've established the order of your rows of patchwork squares, take the middle piece and place the 1-inch strip on top of it with the right side of the strip facing the back of the strip of patchwork squares. Then turn it over, holding onto the tape to keep it in place. Now attach the 2-inch strip to the other side, then pin in place. With the raw edges at the top, sew the strips in place, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish. With the 2 backs facing together, pin the 1-inch strip to the bottom row of patchwork squares and then sew together, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish and removing any pins as you go along. Now place the middle row of patchwork squares on top of the bottom row of patchwork squares with both the backs facing. So you want one of the patchwork sides on the top and the other facing down towards your work surface, and pin the 1-inch strip of binding tape to the back of the bottom row of patchwork squares. Then sew your 2 strips of patchwork squares together, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish and removing the pins as you go along. Also remembering to hold the previous seam allowance out of the way so we don't catch it in with our stitching. Right, that's the first 2 rows of patchwork joined together. We just need to do the top stitching, but before we do that we need to give a quick press to the seams and then pin in place. Top stitch 1/8 inch away from the edge on each side, back tacking at the start and the finish and removing the pins as you go along. When you've finished sewing down the first side, turn around and go back down the other side. Then repeat exactly the same process to join the third row of patchwork squares, making sure that you match up the parallel lines with the vertical lines. Then trim all 4 sides to make sure that they are nice and level. Although you think you're going to have an 18-inch square here, it's much more likely to be 17 inches or even less, because the quilting takes up some of the width of the fabric. So don't worry if you've only got 17 inches, that's absolutely fine. But make sure that 17 inch is nice and square. Cut 2 pieces of fabric for the back of your cushion cover. Cut one 18 inches by 13 inches and the other 18 inches by 12 inches. Find the 2 sides that are going to cross over in the centre and turn over by 1 inch and press. And then take that 1 inch and just turn over by half an inch and press again. Now sew down both pieces as close to the edge as you can get, maybe about an eighth of an inch from the edge, backtacking at the start and the finish. Do exactly the same to both sides. Next we need to attach the 2 backing pieces to our patchwork pieces. So face your patchwork pieces down on the work surface with right side facing down, and your backing pieces need to be right side facing up. Place your left side on first, get that level, and then place your right side on top of that. Then pin in place. Sew together, taking a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Sew all the way round, backtacking at the start and the finish. Don't worry, it should be like this. It should be with the right sides outside, because we're going to put some binding tape all the way around the edges. Don't worry, it's not too scary. To make the binding tape, cut a 3.5 inch length of whatever fabric you're going to use, your choice, 3.5 inch wide, and my fabric, as I said before, was 44 inches wide, and I need to join just one length of it to go all around my cushion. To join your binding tape, lay your first piece of fabric across the board and then lay your second piece on top of it, going down at a right angle. Then we're going to draw a line across from one side to the other at a 45-degree angle. If you have something to measure it, I could use my board, but I'm actually just going to use my ruler and go from the top left-hand corner of the top piece to the bottom right hand corner of the top piece. You can just about see it through the top piece of fabric. Then pin in place. I put a pin on each side of the line. Now sew along the line. Press the seam open, turn it over and press on top. Fold the tape in half down the middle and iron. Make sure that you have the right side of the fabric on the outside. Press all the way along the length. Next we need to cut off at a 45-degree angle the end. This is the end that we're going to start with. It's the starting point. Make sure that your fabric is opened out when you do this. That's quite important. And make sure that you do cut the right way. So we're going from the left corner up to the right. So make sure you cut your angle in the right direction. Okay, so it needs to be like that. Now we're going to take the edge where we where we cut off the 45-degree angle, and we're going to turn under about half an inch. So fold it over and then press, and then you'll notice you have some ears sticking out, so just cut these off and give another quick press. And this is how it should look. Pin your binding to the back of your cushion cover and not the front. We start attaching our binding in the middle of a row. Don't start in a corner, this won't work. Pin through just a single layer of fabric. Pull the top piece of fabric back, and about an inch along from where the top piece of fabric started, we're going to put a mark. Now sew, taking a 1/2 inch seam allowance, backtacking at the start and just going as far as the little mark that we made. Now pin or clip the rest of the top edge along to the corner. Well, not quite to the corner. When we get to the corner, we're going to make a mark 1/2 inch from the edge. This may seem a little bit complicated at the moment, but after you've done it a few times, it becomes easy. And it makes life a lot easier in the long run when you come to join your 2 ends of binding tape at the end. So using a pen, any pen will do for this because no one's going to see it. Make a mark on each side, 1/2 inch across and 1/2 inch down. Make sure you can see this. And then we're going to go over to the sewing machine. Now if you remember the mark that we first put on when we first sewed the first piece of binding on, we're going to start a little bit past that mark, and we're going to take a 1/2 inch seam allowance and we're going to sew to that 1/2 inch mark we left at the corner. So keep going till you're nearly there. When I'm nearly at the mark, I put a pin in so I know exactly where to stop. So keep going until you get to that pin, and when you get to that pin, stop with your needle down. Then lift your presser foot and turn all of your fabric to a 45-degree angle, and then we're going to sew from there up to the corner, and then I back tack. There we go. That wasn't too difficult, was it? The next step is a lot easier if you have a cutting mat with lines on it. So line your cushion cover up with the vertical line, and also line your strip of fabric up with the vertical line. So we're going to pull that fabric up so it forms like a little triangle, and then we're going to pull it back down and line it up with the top edge of the corner of the cushion cover. There we go. That's how it should be. We should have that little flap in the centre there. Then I push the flap over to the left hand side so it's back in line with the top of the cushion cover, and then I take my ruler and I'm going to put a little mark half an inch in from the side, which is where my starting point will be. So take your ruler and measure half an inch in from the side. It should also be half an inch from the top. I then put a pin in just to hold this corner in place so that it doesn't move about. Then, starting at the mark you made, sew all the way around down to the next corner, taking a ½ inch seam allowance and back tacking at the start. I don't use pins for this, I just line it up as I go along, making sure that as you're sewing your sides are all level. I haven't marked my ½ inch mark here, so when I get close to the edge I'm going to mark the ½ inch from the edge, and I will also put a pin in it. Continue to sew till you get level with the ½ inch mark, and then stop with your needle down. Then lift your presser foot and turn your fabric again so you can sew off to that corner. So turn your fabric a 45-degree angle and sew at a 45-degree angle directly to that corner. Now take over to your cutting board if you have one, and make sure that your cushion cover is squared up with the lines, and you want to make sure that your binding tape is going directly up and you have that nice 45-degree angle. When you've got that, you can fold it back down on itself and match it up with the top. There we go. Crease it down and then mark your ½ inch in from the side and ½ inch from the top, but you can see your line from the top. Then put a pin in to secure it. Continue sewing all the way around your cushion cover using this method on the corners until you get about 2 inches from the join. Cut off any of the excess binding tape so it's just a little bit longer than where the opening is, and cut it at an angle so you can thread it through nicely, as you can see me doing there. This is not the way that I was taught to finish binding, but it's certainly the easiest way that I know. Then just clip or pin in place and sew across the bottom edge where the join was, taking a ½ inch seam allowance, making sure that we back tack and the start and the finish. Now we need to turn the binding tape over to the other side. Notice that we're finishing on the right side rather than the other side. We're not going to be stitching in the ditch. We're going to make it a little bit easier and stitch on the right side. So turn it all over and clip in place. When you get to the corners, fold one side all the way along to the end and then just fold the other side on top of it, and you should end up with a nice 45-degree angle mitered corner. Now at your sewing machine, sew all the way around on the right side, about 1/8 of an inch from the edge, turning at the corners and removing all your clips as you go along. Sewing on the right side of the patchwork cushion cover like this means you don't have to do any stitching in the ditch. Be careful when you get to the corners, make sure you finish with your needle down, turn and carry on. And sew all the way around until you get back to where you started. And there we have it, a finished quilted cushion cover. Thank you for watching. I do hope you managed to make one of these lovely patchwork cushion covers and you find the binding process fairly easy and not too difficult. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I do hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, could you please like and subscribe? So let's get started.